Now moving on to part 2, evidence of cumulative cultural evolution in non-human animals. So where shall we look for cumulative cultural evolution in animals? The obvious place to look for it would be in our closest relatives, so chimpanzees for instance, and in particular regarding stone tool technique, because the archaeological record shows that humans very early on were using stone tools. And we know that chimpanzees use stones, in particular in the context of nut cracking. And luckily, we also have studies showing that chimpanzees have been doing nut cracking for thousands of years. These 2 studies by Mercader and colleagues. And in these studies, we see no evidence of change over the technique. We don't see any evidence of improvement over time. So the chimpanzees are still doing nut cracking exactly the same way they were doing thousands of years before. They are processing the same kind of food using the same kind of stones. And this is very much the result that we find in many of the studies that we have on animal culture. So for instance, if you think of the study of the Japanese monkeys doing potato washing, for instance, we see the spread of a new behavior, and that spread to the entire group and then remains stable for a very long time, so at least 50 years now. But we don't see any change or any improvement in the technique they were using at the beginning. Similarly, in the study of the British tits with the milk opening behavior, you don't see any change after the spread of the initial one. So that's very much the conclusion that we find from the animal literature, except for some examples, a few examples, where we see something like or suggestive evidence of cumulative cultural evolution. That's the examples that I'm going to present to you now. So for instance, in this study of humpback whale songs, Garland and colleagues showed that humpback whale songs evolve over time, they change over time in different populations. So on the right hand side, you see the Pacific Ocean on the y-axis from East Australia to French Polynesia. And on the y-axis, you have different years from 1998 to 2008. Each color represents a different kind of song that is sung by these whales in this particular location at that particular time. And what you see in this graphic is that the songs originate in East Australia and then they tend to spread across the entire Pacific Ocean towards French Polynesia. And every few years, every 2 years approximately, then you have a change in the songs. They become replaced by something that is completely different. And then that spreads again across the entire Pacific Ocean, and then it gets replaced, and so on and so forth. So we see the evolution of songs over time, but they are not cumulative in the sense that they don't accumulate modifications over time. So it's not really a good, a proper example of cumulative cultural evolution. It's nonetheless an example in which we see the evolution of animal culture. And if you want to know more about whale songs and cetaceans in general, you should watch the lecture by Luc Rendell. Similarly, the study of bird songs revealed their evolution over time, and I really like this succession of papers by Grant and Grant studying Darwin finches in the Galapagos Islands, and in particular this example where you see songs sung by Geospiza fortis over different generations. In this species, the males learn to sing the song of their father, and you see that Grant and Grant have managed to reproduce a genealogy of songs over different generations. So on the top you have the original father, and there are 2 pigs, and on the right hand side you see the evolution of this song, and it's very much preserved across up to 5 different generations. But then on the left hand side you see that this song gets modified. You get one song with 3 pigs, and that again branches into sort of 3 pigs versus 4 pig song, and that evolves again over time. So we see that there is some preservation, of course, of the songs, and that they evolve over time, and there is also new additions and modifications that gets transmitted to future generations. So that is very much an example of cumulative cultural evolution. And the lectures by Andy Whiten and Lucy Aplin also describe this bird song's evolution in more details if you're interested. This example of the evolution of songs in songbirds is also backed up experimentally, in particular with this experiment by Fair and colleagues in 2009, where they studied zebra finches this time, and they noticed that zebra finches in the wild sing a particular type of song. So on the left-hand side, you have a population of wild-type zebra finches, and on the right-hand side, you have an analysis of their song using principal component analysis. So you have the two principal components, and the blue, the sort of blue picture represents the density plot of these songs, and you see that there is sort of high density in the middle, and then that spreads around a little bit. So when you look at the wild-type songs, you get the blue, sort of blue picture. And so what Fair and colleagues did was very original. They picked up an egg from the wild-type population, and then they raised this particular bird in complete isolation. And when you do this, they develop a very bizarre type of song. So I'm going to play you the different songs. So here is a song by the wild-type. And now you can hear the songs by the first individual isolated. Okay, I'm going to play you two different songs, song 1 and song 2. Okay, so you can hear that they are very, very different from the wild types. And these songs are the origin of these different arrows that you see on the picture. Okay, so that's the first song sung by the isolates. And so what Fair and colleagues did after that was create a transmission chain in which they took this first bird with a very bizarre song, and then they paired that bird with another bird isolated from the wild-type population. And then that's the next point of the arrow. And then they created this transmission chain over and over again, over up to 5 different generations. And so you see on the right-hand side the evolution of these songs, and they cluster, they rapidly go back to the sort of wild-type songs, and they cluster around this center, this high peak density of wild-type songs. So that shows that bird songs tend to evolve based on what was present before, and then they tend to go towards something that is shared by the entire population. Finally, the last example that is impressive about cumulative cultural evolution is a study on pigeons by Sasaki and Biro in 2017. And they used basically the same technique as Fair and colleagues did, so this replacement technique. And what they did was take one individual from a population and travel that individual back about 6 kilometers away from that pigeon homing site. And then they released the pigeon, and the pigeon flew back to its homing site. Okay? And they did that 12 times, so that the 12 releases on the top left corner of generation 1, and they did that with one bird, and then they paired that bird with another bird, did 12 releases, then the second with the third, and so on and so forth. Okay, they did that 5 times. And interestingly, they also used 2 different controls. One solo control, in which they release the same bird the same number of times, so 60 times, but always the same bird alone. And also a pair control, in which they took 2 individuals, and they released these 2 individuals 60 times, always in the same place. And what Biro found was this. So you see here the plot of the trajectories between the different conditions, experimental, with a replacement technique, the solo and the pair control condition, and with the different generations in colors. And first of all, you can notice that the experimental condition is much more variable, so there is a lot of variability compared to the solo and the pair condition. So once the pigeons have started to travel a particular route, they tend to stick to that route, even if it varies a bit. And then the other thing is that the experimental condition at the end of it, generation 5 with a black line, the black line is very straight. It goes from the beginning to the end in almost a direct line, compared to the other 2 who are more convoluted. This is backed up by an analysis of route efficiency. So if you look at how well the pigeons are doing, here you have on the y-axis route efficiency, on the x-axis the different generations with the number of releases. For the different conditions, experimental in red, solo in black, and pair in blue. And in the first generation, you see that all the birds improve very, very quickly. and they end up roughly at the same efficiency across the different conditions, which is very reassuring because at this stage there has been no cultural transmission. And then progressively you see that the experimental condition is doing slightly better every generation compared to the other two conditions. And you also see that at the beginning of every generation, the experimental condition is doing worse. And that's probably that's certainly because we introduced new variation at every generation with a new bird who is trying to figure out where to go. And finally, in the center, you see an analysis, and you see that this is backed up by the modeling showing that route efficiency increases only in the experimental condition and not in the other two control conditions. So that's it. That's all we have for cumulative cultural evolution. That's all the evidence we have from natural situations. So animal culture is widespread. I mean, you've seen this across the many lectures before this one, and it can also be stable through time, as with the chimpanzees nutcracking example. However, it does not seem to evolve in the same way that human culture does. It doesn't gradually improve over time. And the few suggestions of cumulative cultural evolutions in animals are not where we might expect them with technology and with apes, despite intense research efforts. So it's not something that we are going to discover very soon, because we've been researching this field for a very long time. And we find examples of cumulative cultural evolution, but in the songs of birds and cetaceans, and also in things that are more transient, like using a route to go somewhere. So the big question is why? Why is it so different? Why is it so difficult for non-human animals to develop cumulative cultural evolution? And that's what we are going to see in the next part of this lecture, part 3.